23-year-old Isabella Moretti thought humiliation was the worst thing that could happen until she caught her boyfriend cheating with the one person she trusted like family. Devastated, she fled through his Milan estate and opened the wrong door, colliding with a man she was never meant to see. Lorenzo De Luca, 50 years old, cold, powerful, terrifyingly magnetic, her boyfriend's father. A hidden Italian mafia king with enemies buried in his past. One forbidden moment ignited something dangerous. And when Lorenzo walked into her university lecture the next morning as her new professor, Isabella realized that what started as shock had turned into a pull she could no longer escape. Welcome, dark romance lovers. If you crave stories that set your heart racing and make you believe in dangerous love, hit that subscribe button right now and help me reach 1,000 subscribers. I promise to bring you more addictive tales that will leave you breathless. Now, let's dive into Isabella and Lorenzo's forbidden world. The music pulsed through the De Luca estate like a heartbeat, each bass note vibrating through Isabella's chest as she stood alone on the marble terrace overlooking Milan's glittering skyline. Around her, beautiful people laughed and drank expensive champagne, celebrating Marco De Luca's 25th birthday with the kind of extravagance that made her small university apartment feel like a different universe entirely. She smoothed down her emerald silk dress, the one she had saved 3 months to buy, and searched the crowd for her boyfriend's face. Marco stood near the fountain, surrounded by his usual circle of wealthy friends, their perfectly styled hair and designer suits making them look like they belonged in a fashion magazine. Isabella had been dating him for 18 months, and in all that time, she could count on one hand the number of times he had truly looked at her the way he looked at his sports cars or his expensive watches. Tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, she had promised herself, would be the night he finally saw her. She took a sip of champagne and felt the bubbles tickle her throat. A woman in a red dress brushed past her, laughing at something her companion said, and Isabella suddenly felt very small. She did not belong here among these people who measured worth in euros and family names. She was just a university student studying art history, the daughter of a middle-class family from the outskirts of Milan, someone who had fallen in love with a boy who lived in a completely different world. Marco finally glanced her way, and for a moment, their eyes met across the crowded terrace. But instead of warmth, Isabella saw something that made her stomach tighten. Indifference. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture so casual it might as well have been directed at a stranger, then turned back to his friends without a second thought. The dismissal cut deeper than any insult could have. Later that evening, Isabella found herself wandering through the vast halls of the estate, her heels clicking against polished marble floors that reflected the golden light from crystal chandeliers. She had excused herself from the party, unable to bear another moment of standing invisible in a crowd of people who looked through her as though she did not exist. The house was enormous, far larger than she had realized, with corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity and rooms she had never seen, despite visiting Marco dozens of times. Her best friend Sofia appeared suddenly from around a corner, her face pale and strained in a way that made Isabella's pulse quicken. Sofia grabbed her wrist without explanation, her fingers cold and trembling, and pulled her toward the grand staircase that led to the private wing of the estate. Isabella tried to ask what was wrong, but Sofia just shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line, and kept walking. They climbed the stairs in silence, the music from the party fading to a distant hum beneath the sound of Isabella's own heartbeat. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though gravity itself was trying to hold her back. Sofia's grip on her wrist never loosened, and when they finally reached the second floor, she stopped in front of a closed door at the end of a long hallway. Sophia turned to face her, and Isabella saw tears gathering in her friend's dark eyes. Without a word, Sophia released her wrist and stepped back, shaking her head as though apologizing for something she could not undo. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Isabella alone in the quiet hallway with nothing but the closed door and a terrible sense of dread building in her chest. Isabella's hand trembled as she reached for the door handle. Some part of her already knew what waited on the other side, the same way animals know when a storm is coming. She pushed the door open slowly, and the world tilted on its axis. The bedroom was enormous, decorated in shades of cream and gold, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate's gardens. A massive bed dominated the center of the room, and on that bed, tangled in expensive sheets, were two people she recognized immediately. Marco, her boyfriend of 18 months, the man she had given her loyalty and patience to, was with her sister. Not just any embrace, but the kind that left no room for misunderstanding or innocent explanation. Time stopped. Isabella's brain tried to process what her eyes were seeing, but the information felt too large, too impossible. Her sister, Julia, was supposed to be in Rome for work. Marco was supposed to love her. Neither of those things could be true if this scene in front of her was real. Julia saw her first. Her eyes went wide, and she pulled away from Marco with a gasp that sounded more annoyed than guilty. Marco turned his head lazily, and when he saw Isabella standing in the doorway, he did not even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, he sighed as though she had interrupted something important. Isabella could not move, could not speak, could not breathe. She just stood there, her emerald dress feeling suddenly too tight, her carefully applied makeup feeling like a mask she wanted to tear off. Marco climbed out of the bed without bothering to cover himself properly, pulling on his pants with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced real consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. He walked toward her slowly, and Isabella finally found the strength to step backward, her body instinctively trying to create distance between them. But Marco kept coming, his handsome face twisted into something ugly that she had never seen before. "You were never going to sleep with me," he said, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. His words hit her like physical blows, each one carefully chosen to cause maximum damage. You and your ridiculous values, acting like you were something special because you wanted to wait. You thought that made you better than everyone else, but it just made you boring. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Behind Marco, Julia had pulled on a robe and was watching the scene with an expression that looked almost bored. That might have been the worst part, Isabella realized. Her sister was not even sorry. "You deserved this," Julia said quietly, examining her fingernails. "You always acted so perfect, so patient, like you were some kind of saint. Maybe now you will understand that the world does not reward people like you. It eats them alive." The cruelty in her sister's voice finally broke through Isabella's shock. She turned and ran, her heels echoing through the hallway as tears blurred her vision. She did not know where she was going, only that she needed to get away, needed to put distance between herself and the two people who had just destroyed her entire understanding of love and loyalty and family. She ran through corridors she did not recognize, past closed doors and marble statues and paintings that probably cost more than her family's house. The tears were falling freely now, hot and desperate, and her breath came in ragged gasps that hurt her chest. She turned a corner and found herself in a part of the estate she had never seen before. A wing that Marco had once mentioned belonged to his father, a man Isabella had never met, despite dating his son for over a year. The restricted wing, the forbidden territory. But Isabella was too devastated to care about rules or boundaries anymore. She pushed through a heavy wooden door and found herself in a dark hallway that smelled like expensive cologne and old leather. At the end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling through the gap. Isabella stumbled toward that light, like a moth drawn to flame, her mind too shattered to think clearly. She pushed the door open and stepped into a room that was completely different from the rest of the estate. This space was masculine and controlled, with dark wood furniture and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves packed with leather-bound volumes. A massive desk dominated one corner, and through another door, she could see the edge of a luxurious bathroom. She collapsed onto a leather sofa near the window and buried her face in her hands, finally allowing herself to break down completely. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside her chest, violent and uncontrollable, the sound of a heart shattering into pieces too small to ever put back together. She cried for the boyfriend who had never loved her, for the sister who had betrayed her, for the fool she had been to believe in either of them. She was so consumed by her grief that she did not hear the bathroom door open, did not realize she was no longer alone, until a deep voice cut through her sobs like a knife through silk. "Who are you? And why are you in my private quarters?" Isabella's head snapped up, her tear-stained face turning toward the source of that voice. A man stood in the doorway to the bathroom, a towel wrapped around his waist, and water still dripping from his dark hair. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his body carved from years of discipline rather than gym vanity. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, handsome in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with power. But it was his eyes that made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. Dark and intense, they pinned her to the sofa with the weight of their attention. She had never seen eyes like that before, eyes that seemed to see straight through all her defenses and into the broken pieces of her soul. This was Lorenzo De Luca, Marco's father, the man who was whispered about in careful tones, whose name carried weight even in a city like Milan, where power was as common as expensive wine. Isabella had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. Lorenzo De Luca was a ghost, a shadow, a man who controlled things from behind closed doors. Some said he was connected to organized crime. Others said he had simply been ruthless in business. No one knew for sure, and no one was brave enough to ask directly. Isabella tried to stand, to apologize, to explain, but her legs would not support her weight. She collapsed back onto the sofa, fresh tears streaming down her face, and Lorenzo's expression shifted from anger to something more complex. He moved toward her slowly, his bare feet silent on the expensive carpet, and Isabella found herself unable to look away from him. "I asked you a question," he said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. He crouched down in front of her, bringing himself to her eye level, and Isabella caught the scent of his soap, clean and masculine. "Who are you?" "Isabella Moretti," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I am Marco's girlfriend." Was Marco's girlfriend? "I do not know anymore." Recognition flickered across Lorenzo's face, followed by something darker. He straightened up and walked to a sideboard against the wall, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He returned and handed her 1 glass, then sat down in the chair across from her, his towel still his only covering. Isabella knew she should be uncomfortable, should be averting her eyes, but somehow his partial state of undress seemed irrelevant compared to the intensity of his presence. "Drink," he commanded, and Isabella obeyed without thinking. The liquid burned her throat, but it also cleared her head slightly, pushing back the fog of devastation that had consumed her. "Now tell me why you are crying in my study," Lorenzo said. His voice was calm but authoritative, the voice of a man who expected honesty and would accept nothing less. So Isabella told him. The words poured out of her like water from a broken dam, telling this stranger things she had not even fully processed herself. She told him about catching Marco in bed with her sister, about the cruel things they had said, about the 18 months she had wasted believing in a love that had never existed. She told him about feeling invisible at the party, about saving for 3 months to buy a dress that Marco had barely noticed, about the way he had looked at her with such complete indifference that she might as well have been a piece of furniture. Lorenzo listened without interrupting, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When she finally finished, exhausted and empty, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. "My son is a fool," he said, "and your sister is cruel. Neither of them deserves your tears." Isabella looked up at him, startled by the validation. She had expected judgment or dismissal, not this quiet understanding from a man who was practically a stranger. Lorenzo held her gaze, and something passed between them in that moment. Something electric and dangerous that neither of them acknowledged aloud. "You should not have wasted your patience on someone who did not value it," Lorenzo continued. "Patience is not weakness. Loyalty is not boring. These things are rare and precious, and anyone who cannot see that is blind." His words wrapped around Isabella's broken heart like a bandage, not healing it, but at least stopping the bleeding. She found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn to this man in a way that made no sense given everything that had just happened. Lorenzo seemed to notice the shift too, because his expression changed, becoming more guarded. The silence stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Isabella's tears had stopped, but her face was still flushed from crying, her lips slightly parted as she tried to catch her breath. Lorenzo's eyes dropped to her mouth for just a fraction of a second, before snapping back to her eyes, and Isabella felt that look all the way down to her toes. "You should go," Lorenzo said abruptly, standing up. His voice had gone cold again, putting distance between them with just a change in tone. "This is not a safe place for you to be right now." Isabella stood as well, suddenly aware of how close they were standing, how the room had somehow grown smaller. She could see the tension in Lorenzo's shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched as though he was fighting something internal. She should leave. She knew she should leave, but her feet would not move. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening, for not judging me." Lorenzo's expression softened for just a moment, and Isabella saw something in his eyes that looked almost like regret. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful control of a man who had spent decades hiding his true feelings. "Go home, Isabella," he said quietly. "Forget about my son. Forget about tonight. You deserve better than any of this." Isabella nodded and turned toward the door, her legs feeling shaky beneath her. But when she reached the threshold, she could not resist looking back one more time. Lorenzo was still standing in the center of the room, his towel wrapped around his waist, watching her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Isabella forced herself to walk away, pulling the door closed behind her and leaving Lorenzo De Luca alone in his private quarters. But as she made her way back through the estate and called a taxi to take her home, she could not shake the memory of those dark eyes or the way her body had responded to his presence. That night, Isabella lay in her small bedroom and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She should have been thinking about Marco and Julia, about betrayal and heartbreak. Instead, all she could think about was Lorenzo De Luca and the way he had looked at her, as though she was something worth seeing. The next morning, Isabella woke up with swollen eyes and a headache that felt like someone had taken a hammer to her skull. She had 3 missed calls from Marco and 7 text messages that she deleted without reading. Julia had not tried to contact her at all, which somehow hurt worse than the affair itself. Isabella dragged herself out of bed and got ready for her Monday morning lecture. moving through her routine like a robot. She pulled her dark hair into a messy bun, applied concealer to hide the worst of the damage from crying, and dressed in jeans and a simple black sweater. The face that stared back at her from the mirror looked older than it had 2 days ago, the innocence in her eyes replaced by something harder. The University of Milan was beautiful in the autumn sunlight, with its historic buildings and courtyards filled with students hurrying to class. Isabella usually loved this walk, loved being part of something bigger than herself. Today, it all felt meaningless. She climbed the steps to the Humanities building and made her way to the lecture hall where her advanced Renaissance art class met every Monday and Wednesday morning. She was early, so the hall was mostly empty. Isabella chose a seat in the middle row, not too close to the front, but not hiding in the back either. She pulled out her notebook and tried to focus on organizing her thoughts, but her mind kept drifting back to the night before, to the moment in Lorenzo's study when everything had felt suspended and charged with possibility. Other students began filtering in, chatting about their weekends and upcoming assignments. Isabella kept her head down, not wanting to engage in small talk. The professor they had last semester had retired, and today they were supposed to meet his replacement. Isabella hoped whoever it was would be boring enough to distract her from her own thoughts. The lecture hall filled up quickly, and right at 9 o'clock, the door at the front of the room opened. Isabella glanced up casually, expecting to see some elderly academic with elbow patches and a forgettable face. Instead, Lorenzo De Luca walked into the room. Isabella's entire body went rigid with shock. It was him. The same man from last night, the same dark eyes and powerful presence. But now he was wearing an expensive charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, and carrying a leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than her entire semester's tuition. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and he moved with the confidence of someone who owned every space he entered. Lorenzo walked to the podium and set down his briefcase, then turned to face the class. His eyes swept across the rows of students, professional and detached, until they landed on Isabella. For one endless moment, they stared at each other, recognition crackling between them like lightning. Isabella saw surprise flash across his face, followed quickly by something that looked like frustration or concern. Then Lorenzo looked away, his expression smoothing into professional neutrality. He picked up a piece of chalk and wrote his name on the board in neat, precise letters. Professor Lorenzo De Luca. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying easily through the lecture hall. "I am Professor De Luca, and I will be teaching this course for the remainder of the semester. I expect punctuality, participation, and original thinking. I do not tolerate laziness or plagiarism. If you have questions, ask them. If you have concerns, address them. I am here to teach you about art, but more importantly, I am here to teach you how to think critically about beauty, power, and meaning." He spoke for another few minutes about the syllabus and his expectations, but Isabella barely heard a word of it. Her mind was racing, trying to process this impossible situation. Lorenzo De Luca was her professor. The man whose presence had affected her so profoundly last night was now in a position of authority over her. This could not be happening. Isabella spent the entire 90-minute lecture in a state of controlled panic. She took notes mechanically, her handwriting shaky and unfocused. Every time Lorenzo's eyes swept across the room, she felt her heart rate spike, terrified that he would call on her or single her out somehow. But he seemed determined to treat her exactly like every other student, asking questions of the people around her, but never directing his attention her way. When the lecture finally ended, Isabella gathered her things as quickly as possible, desperate to escape before Lorenzo could stop her. She was halfway to the door when his voice cut through the chatter of departing students. "Miss Moretti, a word, please." Isabella froze. Around her, Other students glanced her way with curiosity before filing out of the room. Within moments, the lecture hall was empty except for Isabella and Lorenzo, the heavy door swinging shut with a final click that sounded unnervingly like a prison cell closing. Isabella turned slowly to face him, her notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. Lorenzo was leaning against the podium, his arms crossed over his chest, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "This is unexpected," he said quietly. His voice was different now, less formal, more like the man who had listened to her cry in his study. "When you said you were a student, I did not realize you meant here." "I did not know you were a professor," Isabella replied, her own voice barely above a whisper. Marco never mentioned it. "My son and I do not speak much," Lorenzo said, and there was a wealth of history in those simple words. He straightened up and walked down the steps toward her, closing the distance between them until they were standing just a few feet apart. "This complicates things." "What things?" Isabella asked, even though she knew exactly what he meant. She could feel the same tension from last night crackling in the air between them, that magnetic pull that made no logical sense but felt undeniable nonetheless. Lorenzo studied her face for a long moment, his dark eyes intense and searching. "You were upset last night," he said carefully. "Vulnerable. I should have sent you away immediately, but I did not. That was my mistake." "It was not a mistake," Isabella said, surprising herself with her own boldness. "You helped me. You made me feel like I was not crazy for being hurt." "You should be focusing on healing from what my son did to you," Lorenzo said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Not creating new complications." "Maybe I don't want simple," Isabella said. "Maybe I am tired of playing it safe with people who do not deserve it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Lorenzo's expression shifted, becoming more conflicted. He took a step closer to her, then seemed to catch himself and stepped back again, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that looked almost frustrated. "You do not understand what you are saying," he said. "I am twice your age. I am your professor. I am your ex-boyfriend's father. There are a dozen reasons why anything between us would be wrong and dangerous and impossible." "Then why does it not feel wrong?" Isabella asked. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she refused to look away from him. "Why does it feel like the only real thing that has happened to me in months?" Lorenzo closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering strength. When he opened them again, his expression had hardened into something more controlled. "Because you are confusing gratitude and emotional vulnerability with attraction," he said. "You are looking for someone to validate you after being hurt, and I happen to be available. But this is not real, Isabella. And even if it were, acting on it would destroy both of our lives." His words should have stung, should have made her feel foolish and small. But Isabella could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands were clenched at his sides, the carefully controlled breathing that suggested he was fighting something just as hard as she was. "You are lying," she said softly. "Not to me. To yourself." Lorenzo's control cracked for just a moment, and Isabella saw raw emotion flash across his face before he locked it down again. He turned away from her, walking back toward the podium, putting distance between them. "Go to your next class," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "And from now on, we maintain a strictly professional relationship. I am your professor, nothing more." "Is that understood?" Isabella wanted to argue, wanted to push back against his walls, but she could see that he had made up his mind, at least for now. So she nodded and left the lecture hall without another word, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Over the next 2 weeks, Isabella tried to focus on her studies and put both Marco and Lorenzo out of her mind. She blocked her ex-boyfriend's number, after he sent increasingly angry messages demanding she talk to him. Julia reached out once through their mother, but Isabella refused the call. She was done with both of them. But Lorenzo was harder to forget. She saw him twice a week in class, and every lecture was a special kind of torture. He was a brilliant teacher, passionate about art history, and skilled at making even the driest material come alive. Isabella found herself genuinely engaged in his discussions of Renaissance techniques and the politics of patronage, her hand shooting up to answer questions more than she ever had before. And if Lorenzo seemed to call on her more often than other students, if his eyes lingered on her face just a fraction too long when she spoke, neither of them acknowledged it. They maintained the fiction of a purely academic relationship, even as the tension between them grew with every passing class. One Wednesday afternoon, Isabella stayed late in the library, working on a research paper. The building was nearly empty, most students having left for dinner or evening activities. She was so absorbed in her work that she did not notice Lorenzo until he was standing right beside her table. She looked up with a start, her heart immediately jumping into her throat. Lorenzo was carrying his briefcase and wearing a long black coat that made him look even more intimidating than usual. His expression was carefully neutral, but Isabella could see something flickering in his eyes that looked like uncertainty. "You have been asking excellent questions in class," he said. His voice was quiet, meant only for her. "Your insights about Caravaggio's use of darkness were particularly astute." "Thank you," Isabella replied, not sure what else to say. Was that all he wanted? To compliment her academic performance? Lorenzo glanced around the nearly empty library, then pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. This was a clear violation of the professional distance he had insisted on maintaining, and they both knew it. "I have been thinking about what you said," he admitted quietly. "About me lying to myself." Isabella's breath caught. She closed her notebook slowly, giving him her full attention. "And you were right," Lorenzo said. He looked at her with such intensity that Isabella felt it like a physical touch. "I have been telling myself that what I feel is inappropriate, or impossible, or wrong. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying than that." "What truth?" Isabella whispered. "That I think about you constantly," Lorenzo said. "That I have to force myself not to watch you during lectures. That every time you raise your hand to answer a question, I feel something in my chest that I have not felt in over a decade. That when I see other male students talking to you, I have to physically restrain myself from interfering." His confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Isabella could see the cost it took for him to admit these things, how much he was risking by being vulnerable with her. "Lorenzo," she said softly, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I need you to understand something," he continued. "I am not a good man, Isabella. I have done things in my past that would make you run if you knew the full truth. I have hurt people. I have made choices that haunt me. My wife died because of my failures, because I could not protect her from the enemies I made. I have spent the last 5 years trying to build a legitimate life, to teach and to atone for my sins. But those sins do not disappear just because I wish they would. I am not asking you to be perfect," Isabella said. "I am asking you to be honest. With me and with yourself." "If I do this," Lorenzo said slowly, "if I allow myself to feel what I feel for you, there is no going back. I do not do casual, Isabella. I do not do temporary. When I commit to something, I commit completely. And right now, that terrifies me almost as much as walking away from you does." Isabella reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough, the hand of a man who had worked with more than just books and lectures. Lorenzo looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, and Isabella saw the exact moment he stopped fighting. "Come with me," he said. They left the library together, not touching, but acutely aware of each other. Lorenzo led her to the faculty parking lot and opened the passenger door of a sleek black car that probably cost more than Isabella's entire education. She climbed in without hesitation, and they drove through the darkening streets of Milan in charged silence. Lorenzo's apartment was in an exclusive building overlooking the Navigli district, all exposed brick and modern design. He let them in and immediately poured them both glasses of wine, as though needing something to do with his hands. Isabella walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city lights reflecting on the canal below. She heard Lorenzo come up behind her, felt the heat of his body, even though he was not quite touching her. Her reflection in the window showed a young woman with wide eyes and flushed cheeks, standing in front of a man who looked at her like she was something precious and dangerous all at once. "Last chance," Lorenzo said quietly. "If you want to leave, leave now. Because once I kiss you, once I allow myself to have you, I will not let you go easily." Isabella turned to face him, tilting her head back to meet his dark eyes. She reached up and placed her hand against his chest, feeling his heart pounding beneath her palm. "Then kiss me," she whispered. Lorenzo's control finally shattered. He pulled her against him with a groan, one hand tangling in her hair, while the other wrapped around her waist. When his lips met hers, Isabella felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. The kiss was hungry and desperate, nothing like the polite pecks she had shared with Marco. This was a man who knew exactly what he wanted and was done pretending otherwise. Isabella melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back with all the pent-up desire that had been building for weeks. Lorenzo walked her backward until her back hit the window, the cold glass contrasting with the heat of his body against her front. He kissed her like he was trying to memorize the taste of her, like he had been starving, and she was the first meal he had seen in years. They barely made it to the bedroom. Clothes were discarded in a trail across the apartment, hands exploring and mapping new territory. When Lorenzo finally laid her down on his bed, he paused, looking down at her with such reverence that Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. "And I am going to spend the rest of the night showing you exactly how much you are worth." What followed was tender and passionate and overwhelming. Lorenzo took his time learning every inch of her, proving with his hands and mouth and body that she was precious to him. When they finally came together, Isabella cried out, not from pain, but from the intensity of feeling something real for the first time in her life. Lorenzo held her gaze the entire time, refusing to let her hide or disconnect, making her feel every moment of their connection. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, both breathing hard. Lorenzo pulled her against his chest, and Isabella listened to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feeling more at peace than she had in months. "Stay," Lorenzo murmured against her hair. "Stay the night." Isabella nodded, too content to speak. She drifted off to sleep wrapped in his arms, feeling safe and cherished in a way she had never experienced before. She woke up alone. The gray light of early morning filtered through the windows, and the bed beside her was empty and cold. Panic seized Isabella's chest immediately. This was it. This was the moment Lorenzo regretted everything and pushed her away. She sat up, clutching the sheet to her chest, fighting back tears. Then the bedroom door opened, and Lorenzo walked in carrying a tray with coffee and pastries. He was wearing sweatpants and nothing else, his hair slightly mussed from sleep. When he saw the expression on her face, his own expression softened. "I thought you left," Isabella whispered, hating how vulnerable she sounded. Lorenzo set the tray down and climbed back into bed, pulling her into his arms. "Never," he said firmly. "I went to get you breakfast because I wanted to see you eat in my bed. I wanted to watch you drink coffee while wearing nothing but my shirt. I wanted to start the day proving to you that last night was not a mistake." Isabella buried her face against his chest, breathing in his scent. "I was so scared," she admitted. "I know," Lorenzo said, stroking her hair, "and I understand why. But you need to understand something, Isabella. I am 50 years old. I am long past the age of casual encounters or meaningless nights. When I took you to my bed, I did it knowing exactly what I was doing. I am claiming you. You are mine now, if you want to be. And I do not give up what is mine." His words should have scared her, should have felt possessive or controlling. Instead, they wrapped around her like a promise, like safety, like belonging. They spent the entire day in bed, talking and touching and learning each other. Lorenzo told her about his late wife, about the love they had shared, and the guilt he carried about her death. Isabella told him about growing up in her sister's shadow, always feeling like she was not quite enough. They built something that day that went deeper than physical attraction, something that felt like it might actually last. By the end of the week, their relationship was no longer a secret, at least not to anyone paying attention. They tried to be discreet on campus, maintaining professional distance during lectures. But after class, Lorenzo would linger in his office until Isabella could slip in, and they would steal moments together, between meetings and study sessions. They met at his apartment several evenings a week, cooking dinner together and falling into bed afterward. Lorenzo was insatiable, always finding excuses to touch her, to pull her close, to remind her that she belonged to him. Isabella had never felt so desired, so worshipped, so completely seen. But not everyone was blind to what was happening. A student named Matteo, who had been trying to get Isabella's attention since the beginning of the semester, noticed the way she looked at Professor De Luca, noticed how she stayed after class, how she seemed distracted and glowing at the same time. Matteo was jealous and vindictive, and he decided to do something about it. One afternoon, Matteo followed Isabella from class. He waited outside the humanities building with his phone ready, watching as she circled around to the side entrance that led to the faculty offices. 20 minutes later, she emerged, looking flushed and happy, and Matteo snapped several photos. Then he waited another 15 minutes until Professor De Luca came out, straightening his tie. Matteo spent the next week gathering evidence. He photographed Isabella and Lorenzo leaving the building at staggered times. He caught them together in Lorenzo's car in the parking lot, their faces close in conversation. He even managed to capture a photo of them walking into Lorenzo's apartment building together one evening. When he felt he had enough, he created an anonymous social media account and posted everything. The scandal exploded overnight. By morning, the photos were everywhere, spreading across student forums and social media like wildfire. The captions were brutal and explicit, painting Isabella as a home wrecker who had seduced her professor for better grades. They called Lorenzo a predator who took advantage of vulnerable students. The university's administration was tagged repeatedly with demands for immediate action. Isabella woke to hundreds of notifications on her phone. She sat up in Lorenzo's bed, her stomach dropping as she scrolled through message after message. The comments were vicious and cruel, attacking everything from her character to her appearance. People she had never spoken to were calling her names that made her feel physically sick. Lorenzo emerged from the bathroom and immediately saw her face. He took the phone from her trembling hands and read through the posts, his expression growing darker with each swipe. Then he set the phone aside and pulled her into his arms. "This changes nothing," he said firmly. "They can say whatever they want. It does not change what we are to each other." "But the university," Isabella whispered. "Your job, my reputation." "I do not care about my job if it means losing you," Lorenzo said, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. "And your reputation will survive this. The truth is on our side. You earned every grade you received before we were together, and I have documentation to prove it." That afternoon, they received official summons from the university administration. They were interviewed separately, Isabella by the dean of students and Lorenzo by the provost. Isabella sat in an uncomfortable chair while administrators questioned her about her relationship with Professor DeLuca, about whether she felt coerced or pressured, about whether he had promised her favorable treatment in exchange for personal involvement. Isabella answered every question honestly, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. She admitted the relationship, but insisted it had not begun until after her grades were submitted for the previous assignment. She explained that she had never asked Lorenzo for special treatment, and that he had never offered any. She told them that what they shared was real and based on mutual respect and genuine feelings. Lorenzo's interview was similarly intense. He sat across from the provost and the head of the ethics committee, answering questions about his judgment and professionalism. He refused to deny his feelings for Isabella or to apologize for them, but he provided documentation showing that her work had been consistently excellent even before they were involved. He offered to recuse himself from grading her assignments for the remainder of the semester to have another professor evaluate her work. After 2 weeks of investigation, the university reached a decision. No policies had been technically violated since Isabella was an adult and had never been enrolled in Lorenzo's class before their relationship began. However, to avoid the appearance of impropriety, Isabella would be transferred to a different section of the course, taught by another professor. Lorenzo would receive a formal written warning in his file and would be required to attend training on appropriate faculty-student boundaries. The scandal continued to rage online, but slowly, the attention shifted to other targets. Isabella learned to ignore the stares and whispers in the hallways, walking with her head high even when people stopped talking as she passed. Lorenzo remained a steady presence in her life, proving every day that he had meant what he said about not letting her go. But the damage went beyond just campus gossip. 2 days after the university's decision, Isabella received a phone call from her mother. The conversation was brief and brutal. Her parents had seen the photos and the accusations. They were ashamed and disappointed, and until Isabella ended this inappropriate relationship, she was no longer welcome in their home. Isabella sat on Lorenzo's couch after the call, numb with shock. She had expected anger, but she had not expected complete rejection. Lorenzo held her while she processed the loss, understanding without needing explanation the particular pain of being abandoned by family. "If it is any consolation," he said quietly, "you are not alone in that experience. My son has made it clear that he considers me dead too, him." "Have you heard from Marco?" Isabella asked. "Not directly," Lorenzo said, "but I received a message through my lawyer. He wants nothing to do with me. He claims I betrayed him by being with you, as though you were his property to be respected rather than a person who could make her own choices." "I am sorry," Isabella whispered. "Do not be," Lorenzo said firmly. "Marco showed his true character when he cheated on you. If he cannot accept that you have moved on and found something real, that is his weakness, not yours." That evening, there was a pounding on Lorenzo's door. When he opened it, Marco stood in the hallway, his face twisted with rage. He shoved past his father and into the apartment, his eyes immediately finding Isabella on the couch. "You are pathetic," Marco spat at her. "You could not handle being rejected, so you had to run to my father. What is this? Some kind of sick revenge?" Isabella stood up, her hands clenched at her sides. "This has nothing to do with you," she said. You stopped mattering to me the moment I walked into that bedroom." Marco laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You are just another one of his conquests," he said. "Did he tell you what he really is? Did he explain where all his money comes from?" "That is enough," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level that Isabella had never heard before. He moved between Marco and Isabella, physically blocking his son's advance. "You need to leave now." "Or what?" Marco challenged. "You will hurt me like you hurt all those other people? You think you can just walk away from who you are and play professor and pretend to be legitimate? You are a criminal, father, and she deserves to know that." "I have told her everything she needs to know," Lorenzo said. "Now get out of my home before I do something we will both regret." Marco stared at his father for a long moment, then turned his glare to Isabella. "You are a fool if you think this will end well," he said. "He destroys everything he touches. Just ask my mother." "Oh, wait, you cannot. She is dead because of him." Marco left, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. Isabella stood frozen, her mind racing with questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. Lorenzo turned to face her, and she saw guilt and pain etched into every line of his face. "What did he mean?" Isabella asked quietly. "About your wife." Lorenzo walked to the window and stared out at the city, his shoulders tense. "My wife, Maria, died 7 years ago," he said. "She was killed by rivals in the organization I used to control. They wanted to send me a message, to hurt me where I was most vulnerable. They succeeded." Isabella's heart clenched. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I have spent every day since then trying to build a different life," Lorenzo continued. "I stepped away from that world, liquidated my illegal interests, and focused on legitimate business and eventually teaching. But Marco is right about one thing. My past does not simply disappear because I wish it would. The enemies I made are still out there. The debts I owe, both moral and financial, still exist." "Are you in danger?" Isabella asked. "Am I in danger?" Lorenzo turned to face her. "I have taken precautions," he said. "I have security measures in place, people I trust watching for threats. But I would be lying if I said there was no risk. My world, the world I used to inhabit, does not forgive or forget easily." Isabella walked over to him and took his hands in hers. "Tell me everything," she said. "No more protecting me from the truth. If I am going to be with you, I need to know what I am choosing." So Lorenzo told her. He explained about the organization he had built and controlled for nearly 2 decades, about the money he had moved and the violence he had sanctioned. He told her about the people he had hurt, the choices he regretted, the lines he had crossed that could never be uncrossed. He laid out his past like a map of scars, expecting her to run. Instead, Isabella listened until he was finished, then squeezed his hands. "I am not naive enough to think the past does not matter," she said. "But I also know that people can change, that they can choose a different path. You have spent 7 years trying to atone for your mistakes. That has to count for something." "You should be terrified of me," Lorenzo said. "Maybe," Isabella agreed. "But I am more terrified of losing what we have. I choose you, Lorenzo. All of you, past included." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms and held her like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the world. They stood there for a long time, 2 broken people choosing each other, despite every rational reason not to. Over the next month, they built a routine. Isabella threw herself into her studies, determined to prove that her academic success had nothing to do with their relationship. Lorenzo continued teaching, though he was more careful now about maintaining appropriate boundaries with all his students. In private, they were inseparable, spending every possible moment together. Lorenzo taught Isabella to cook traditional Italian dishes, his hands guiding hers as they made fresh pasta from scratch. She introduced him to contemporary art exhibitions that he had never paid attention to before, showing him perspectives he had dismissed as frivolous. They talked about everything and nothing, building the kind of deep intimacy that only comes from complete honesty. But the shadow of Lorenzo's past was never far away. One evening, as Isabella was leaving the library alone, a man stepped out of the shadows and blocked her path. He was tall and thin, with cold eyes, and a smile that made her skin crawl. "Isabella Moretti," he said, as though tasting her name. "Lorenzo's new pet. I have been wanting to meet you." "Who are you?" Isabella demanded, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. "An old friend of your boyfriend's," the man said. "We used to do business together before he decided he was too good for us. I just wanted to introduce myself, let you know that we are watching. Lorenzo cannot protect you from everything, little girl." Before Isabella could respond, the man walked away, disappearing into the evening crowd. Isabella stood there shaking, her phone clutched in her hand. She immediately called Lorenzo, and he was at the university within 10 minutes, his face grim. That night, Lorenzo sat her down and explained the full extent of the security measures he had put in place. He showed her the tracking software on her phone, the bodyguards who had been discreetly following her for weeks, the panic button disguised as a piece of jewelry. Isabella felt violated and protected at the same time, understanding for the first time the real cost of loving someone with Lorenzo's history. "I want to learn to protect myself," she said. "I do not want to be helpless." Lorenzo studied her face, then nodded slowly. "I know someone who can teach you," he said, "but it will not be easy." The next day, Lorenzo introduced Isabella to Francesca, a woman in her 40s, who moved with the deadly grace of a professional fighter. Francesca had worked security for Lorenzo's organization years ago, and now ran a private training facility. She agreed to teach Isabella self-defense, basic combat techniques, and situational awareness. Isabella trained 3 times a week, learning how to break holds and strike vulnerable points and read dangerous situations before they escalated. The physical training was exhausting, but it gave her a sense of control she had been missing. Lorenzo would sometimes watch her sessions, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. 2 months after the library encounter, Isabella was walking home from campus when she felt someone following her. She used the techniques Francesca had taught her, checking reflections in windows and taking unexpected turns. When she confirmed the tale, she called Lorenzo and headed for a crowded cafe instead of his apartment. The man following her was younger this time, probably mid-20s, with nervous energy that suggested he was not a professional. Isabella sat in the cafe with her back to the wall and waited for Lorenzo to arrive. When he did, he was not alone. 2 large men in dark suits flanked him, their presence making other patrons shift uncomfortably. Lorenzo spoke briefly with the men, then came to sit across from Isabella. His face was harder than she had ever seen it, the controlled violence of his past visible in every line of his body. "This ends now," he said quietly. "I'm done playing defense." "What are you going to do?" Isabella asked, suddenly afraid not for herself, but for what Lorenzo might become to protect her. "What I should have done months ago," Lorenzo said. "I am going to have a conversation with some old associates, make it clear that you are off limits. Permanently. Do not do anything that will pull you back into that world," Isabella pleaded. "We can go to the police." "The police cannot protect you from these people," Lorenzo said. "But I can. Trust me, Isabella. I know how to handle this without crossing lines I cannot uncross." Isabella wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. This was the man he used to be, surfacing to protect what was his. She both feared and loved him in that moment, understanding that some parts of his nature would never be fully tamed. Lorenzo left with his security team, and Isabella waited at the cafe, her hands shaking around her coffee cup. Hours passed with no word. She tried calling him repeatedly, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Panic set in as evening became night, and she imagined the worst possible scenarios. Finally, at nearly midnight, Lorenzo returned to his apartment, where Isabella had been pacing frantically. He looked exhausted, but unharmed, and he immediately pulled her into his arms. "It is done," he said simply. "No one will threaten you again." "What did you do?" Isabella asked, pulling back to look at his face. "I reminded certain people why it was a bad idea to challenge me," Lorenzo said. "No blood was shed, if that is what you are asking. But I made my position clear. You are under my protection, and anyone who touches you answers to me. The old alliances still mean something, even if I am no longer actively involved." Isabella wanted to feel relieved, but instead, she felt guilty. "You risked everything for me," she said. "Your new life, your legitimacy, everything you have been building." "You are my new life," Lorenzo said firmly. "Nothing else matters if I lose you." They held each other in the darkness, both understanding that they had crossed another threshold. There was no going back to simple or safe. They were in this together, for better or worse. The following week brought an unexpected development. Isabella received a call from the hospital. Her sister Julia had been admitted after a suicide attempt. Despite everything that had happened, Isabella felt her heart clench with fear and old, instinctive love. She told Lorenzo, and he immediately drove her to the hospital without judgment or hesitation. Julia looked small and broken in the hospital bed, her wrists bandaged and her face pale. When she saw Isabella, tears began streaming down her cheeks. Isabella sat in the chair beside the bed, and for a long moment, neither sister spoke. "I'm sorry," Julia finally whispered, "for everything. I was jealous of you my entire life, jealous of how good you were, how patient and kind. I wanted to hurt you because I hated myself, and I used Marco to do it. I know it was unforgivable." "Why did you hate yourself?" Isabella asked quietly. "Because I am not really your sister," Julia said. "I was adopted. Our parents never told you, but I found out years ago. I spent my whole life feeling like I did not belong, like I had to prove I deserved to be part of the family. And you were always so effortlessly good, so easy to love. I could not stand it." Isabella felt tears burning her own eyes. "You are my sister," she said. "Adoption does not change that. But what you did still hurt me deeply." "I know," Julia said. "I do not expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that it was never really about you. It was about my own brokenness." They talked for over an hour, both crying and beginning the long process of understanding each other. Lorenzo waited in the hallway, giving them privacy, but ready to support Isabella the moment she needed him. When she finally emerged, exhausted and emotionally drained, he wrapped his arm around her and led her home. That night, Isabella lay in bed with her head on Lorenzo's chest. "Do you think people can really change?" she asked. "Or are we all just who we have always been?" "I think people can choose to be better," Lorenzo said. "But it takes work and intention, and usually some kind of catalyst. You are my catalyst, Isabella. You make me want to be the man I should have been all along." Isabella kissed him then, pouring all her love and trust into that kiss. They made love slowly and tenderly, reaffirming their connection after a day of emotional turmoil. Afterward, as Isabella drifted off to sleep, Lorenzo whispered against her hair. "Marry me." Isabella's eyes flew open. She sat up and looked at him in the dim light filtering through the curtains. "What?" "Marry me," Lorenzo repeated, his dark eyes serious and intense. I know it is fast, and I know people will judge us, and I know all the rational arguments against it. But I also know that I love you more than I have ever loved anything in my life. I know that I want to wake up to your face every morning for the rest of my days. I know that you are the only good thing I have done in years. So marry me, Isabella. Let me make you my wife." Isabella felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Lorenzo pulled a small box from his nightstand drawer, and Isabella laughed through her tears. "You had this planned," she accused. "I have had the ring for 3 weeks," Lorenzo admitted. "I was waiting for the right moment, but tonight made me realize there is no such thing as a perfect moment. There is just now, and us, and the choice we make to be together." The ring was beautiful, a simple platinum band with a single diamond that caught the light like a star. Lorenzo slipped it onto her finger, and Isabella marveled at how right it felt, how completely certain she was, despite every logical reason to hesitate. They announced their engagement quietly, telling only a few close friends and Lorenzo's security team. The response was mixed. Some people congratulated them genuinely, while others whispered that Isabella was making a terrible mistake. The university administration raised eyebrows, but could say nothing since Isabella was no longer Lorenzo's student. Marco sent a single text message to his father. "You are both dead to me." Lorenzo deleted it without responding. But not everyone was hostile. Francesca, Isabella's self-defense instructor, gave her a fierce hug and told her she was tougher than she looked. A few of Isabella's classmates from other courses reached out with genuine support. And surprisingly, Lorenzo's son from his first marriage, a 30-year-old named Alessandro who lived in Rome, called to offer tentative congratulations. Alessandro flew to Milan the following week and met Isabella and Lorenzo at a quiet restaurant. The dinner was awkward at first, Alessandro clearly struggling to reconcile the father he remembered with this version, who had fallen in love with someone so young. But as the evening progressed, and he saw how Lorenzo looked at Isabella, how gentle and protective he was with her, Alessandro's resistance began to soften. "You make him happy," Alessandro said to Isabella, as Lorenzo briefly left the table to take a phone call. "I have not seen him like this since before my mother died. It is strange and uncomfortable, but it is also good. He deserves happiness after everything he has been through." "Thank you," Isabella said. "That means more than you know. Just promise me you will keep him from sliding back into his old life," Alessandro said. "He has worked hard to be legitimate, to build something better. Do not let the past pull him under." "I promise," Isabella said, and she meant it. They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at Lorenzo's apartment. Only a handful of people attended. Francesca, Alessandro, a few of Lorenzo's former business associates, who had also gone legitimate, and surprisingly, Isabella's sister Julia, who had been released from the hospital and was working on her own recovery. Isabella wore a simple white dress that Lorenzo had helped her choose, and when she walked toward him with her hand in Francesca's, she saw tears in his eyes. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising honesty and loyalty and the courage to choose each other every single day. When Lorenzo kissed her as his wife, Isabella felt the past finally releasing its grip on both of them. They were creating something new, something that belonged only to them. The months that followed were not easy. They faced continued judgment and whispered gossip. Isabella had to transfer universities to complete her degree, starting fresh at a school where no one knew about the scandal. Lorenzo left his teaching position and focused on his legitimate business interests, finding new purpose in mentoring former criminals who were trying to build better lives. Together, they established a foundation that provided education and job training for people leaving organized crime. It was Lorenzo's way of giving back, of using his knowledge of that world to help others escape it. Isabella threw herself into the work, using her art history background to develop programs that taught creative and critical thinking skills. 1 year after their wedding, Isabella graduated with her degree. Lorenzo sat in the audience, clapping louder than anyone else when she walked across the stage. That night, they celebrated at home, and Isabella gave him a gift she had been keeping secret for weeks. It was a small ultrasound photo. Lorenzo stared at the image, his hands shaking slightly. "You are pregnant?" 12 weeks, Isabella confirmed, her voice soft with emotion. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." Lorenzo pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of glass and steel at the same time, precious and strong. He kissed her deeply, then dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her still flat stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for giving me a second chance at everything." Their daughter was born on a spring morning, tiny and perfect and screaming with life. They named her Maria Francesca, after Lorenzo's late wife and the woman who had taught Isabella to be strong. Lorenzo cried when he held her for the first time. This tiny human who represented hope and redemption and the future they had built from the ashes of their pasts. Isabella watched her husband cradle their daughter and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. They had fought through scandal and danger and judgment to get here. They had chosen each other when everyone said they should not. They had built something real and lasting and good. 2 years later, their family was complete when they welcomed a son. Alessandro came to visit regularly, having fully accepted Isabella as his stepmother and embraced his role as big brother to his younger siblings. Even Julia slowly rebuilt her relationship with Isabella, attending family dinners and working on her own healing. Marco never reached out, never acknowledged his father's new family. But Lorenzo said it was okay, that some relationships could not be salvaged, and that was not a failure. It was just the truth. Isabella completed her doctorate and became a curator at a small but prestigious gallery in Milan. Lorenzo continued his work with the foundation, finding purpose in helping others leave the world he had once controlled. They raised their children with honesty about the past, but hope for the future. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Lorenzo took Isabella back to the spot where they had first met, his private study in the estate that now belonged to someone else. They stood in that room where she had cried and he had listened, where everything had begun with a forbidden moment that changed both their lives forever. "I would do it all again," Lorenzo said, pulling her close. "Every scandal, every fight, every moment of doubt. It was all worth it to end up here with you." Isabella kissed him, tasting salt from tears neither of them bothered to hide. "Me too," she whispered. "Always. You." The scandal had faded into memory, replaced by the reality of two people who had chosen each other against all odds and built a life that proved love could conquer even the darkest pasts. They were not perfect. Their story was not neat or simple or easy to explain, but it was theirs, and it was real, and it was enough. If this story made you feel something, if it made your heart race and your breath catch, please let me know in the comments. Tell me what type of content you would love to see on my channel, and I will make it available. Your support means everything, and I cannot wait to bring you more stories that make you believe in dangerous, all-consuming, forever love.